Okay, I'm going to start breaking down the rear axle assembly and rear end here. And to take the hub off on this side, just remove a cotter pin, large nut, large castle nut, big large washer. And then before you can slide that off, you got to remove the brake calipers, which the hydraulic one was already missing on this. And this is the manual brake caliper, which you take two Allen bolts out, and it just comes apart in two halves. And this little piece kind of just falls out with one of the brake shoes, but this just goes with the rounded side facing in here, and then the shoe sits in there. And then what happens is when this lever gets moved, and this lever gets pulled forward by the cable, it's got a bevel to it inside there that pushes that little cylindrical piece out. Okay, there's this little rubber washer right here. And then there's the seals right there, and the bearing, the outboard axle bearing is inside there. This hub comes off the same way, castle nut and washer. This one was tighter though, so I used a puller. Part of this wheel bearing came off with the hub, so that wheel bearing is broken. So I'll have to get that off of there. Okay, so here's that rear hub that has the part of the bearing still stuck on it, and I've got it mounted in a vise, and I've stuck a piece of wood in here to protect the beveled leading face of that shaft, that splined part. Don't want that to get damaged, because that actually helps you insert it through the seal area. Anyways, make a long story short, got it mounted so it won't get all marred up, and now I got to try and separate that. And you can't really grab it with channel locks or anything. I tried that, but it's such a smooth, hardened surface that you really can't get a grip on it. So I've already got it moved out about a 1/16 of an inch, and what I did was I took a sharp instrument, in this case I took a putty knife with a nice sharp edge to it, and actually stuck it right in there and tapped it on all three sides that are exposed, and was able to pop it out that much. And now I'll be able to get a stronger tool in there, like a screwdriver or a cold chisel, and pry it out. Now I'll just take a screwdriver blade that's got a wedge shape to it and tap it in along the side of the shaft into that gap. And there we have it. That's the part of the bearing that was broken off, stuck on the shaft, on the hub. Once you get that little gap in there, you get a couple of screwdrivers in there, and you can just kind of twist on them and pry at them, and you'll get it to slide off. Because it is a press fit, but it's a light press fit. But this one had just probably spun on the shaft and That might have been why it was stuck. After cleaning this up, I can actually see the part number right on it. Not going to be able to see it with this camera, but it's another NTN bearing. It's D as in Delta, E as in Echo, 0678, C as in Charlie, 512. So again, if you wanted to source this bearing from someplace other than an Arctic Cat dealer, you could. I'm going to remove the seal on the outboard side of the axle housing, the rear axle housing, which is just basically going to get a big screwdriver in there and pry it out. Okay, seal popped out real easy. Cleaning off all the gunk and everything actually exposes some good part numbers. Again, whenever you find part numbers like this, you can usually source these through any place that sells industrial seals and things like that, and save quite a bit of money over the OEM Arctic Cat part. So that's always a good idea, to save the old seals until you get all the numbers off of them. Sometimes you're going to need magnification to look at some of the really small stuff. And then there's the broken bearing and the half of it, and that's just held in by a circlip and or a snap ring. And I've got special pliers that are going to go in these two little tiny holes right here, and that's basically going to take that ring right out, and then that bearing is going to come out with a little bit of persuasion. Okay, those snap rings are going to need some heavy duty snap ring pliers, and I just went and found my pair in their junk. So until I get a pair of snap ring pliers, I'm going to have to hold off on getting these bearings out. Okay, back to the rear axles. Going to remove these bearings in the rear axles, and that involves removing this snap ring, which was able to do that with a pair of snap ring pliers from the auto parts store. These are cheapies. They were about $16, and they were still even better than the ones I had, which failed, so I threw those out. And I was able to get the clip out, and once I get the clip out, the trick is to get that bearing out. It has to come out in this direction, straight up and out. Here's a slick way to get that bearing out. From the back side, take a piece of 1.25 inch black pipe, kind they use for gas lines and for sometimes on boilers. You can get it at most home centers, and it's like a perfect fit. And then you just firmly grasp the shaft and slam that in there, and it'll actually pop it right out. I actually did it a few times, and of course, since the race was broken, all the bearings went flying, but who cares, that one's junk anyways. You can see it actually already started to move out, and there we go. After just a few more taps, it's already well on its way. And there we have it, one wheel bearing removed. Here's the other rear axle bearing removed. This is what it looks like when it comes out in a one piece. It's a double bearing. It's got 2 rows of ball bearings side by side, and it's got a good part number on it. D as in Delta, E as in Echo, 0678, C as in Charlie, S or 512, or Z. Okay, this is one of the rear axles after I cleaned it up, and it actually was in really good shape. Not much rust on it at all. Matter of fact, really no rust. And cleaned it up nice, and that looks good. And of the 2 rear axle housings, it's easy to tell which of the 2 that came out of, because one of them, this one, actually looks to be in much better shape. It's kind of hard to see. There's not much you can see down there, but it looks just generally a lot cleaner. There's a little bit of debris and stuff in there. We'll clean that out. That'll be a piece of cake. And that's opposed to the other housing. The other housing, apparently the outboard seal head failed a while ago, and this was continuously ran through mud puddles and who knows what else, and just stuff had gotten in there. And as the machine would stop running, it would just settle in the bottom here, so you can actually kind of see there's almost like a path of rust and scale along that bottom edge. So this one's much dirtier inside, and consequently the other axle, which I have soaking right now, was also a lot rustier and dirtier than this one. So I'm going to finish cleaning up both of these housings and the axles, and then I can start doing a little bit of reassembly. Well, after cleaning up the axles and looking at the one that was really in kind of rough shape, the area on the inboard side of the axle, this splined area goes into the rear differential, and this area right here is where that seal that's in the rear differential is supposed to ride. You can see how it's supposed to look on the good axle, and this is what this one looks like. It actually looks like there was metal rubbing on this. I'm not sure what the heck that was from. There's actually what looks like a big flake of metal right here. I actually was able to stick a razor blade underneath it there and start to pry it up. So I'm going to see if I can actually pop that off and clean it up on the wire wheel and see what comes of it. But I've got a bad feeling about this. I can't reuse this axle. Oddly enough, the outboard side is actually okay. This area here that the wheel bearing inner seal rides on is okay, and of course the other axle is great on both sides. So well, at first I was worried about this area being all chewed up on this shaft, because I thought that the seal contacted this area here, but I was completely mistaken. I don't know what I was thinking, but actually this inserts into here like this, and this area is actually completely away from the seal. The seal actually rides on that gear assembly inside the differential. So the only question is, why is this all scarred up and why is this all scarred up? There's really nothing that makes contact with. So I have to assume that at some point maybe this failed and came out, pulled out of here while it was spinning, and then before the vehicle came to a stop it got chewed up, or I don't know. But anyways, so these shafts are going to be okay. Alright, here's what the housing looks like after it's cleaned up. Can't really see it, but pretty good. Wire brush only reaches so far down the hole from each end, so in the middle of it is still a little rough spot, but the axle never comes in contact with any of that, so I'm going to just run a rag through there, force it through with a large screwdriver, and rub it back and forth and loosen that up. And now I'm going to clean up the other shaft, the other housing. Okay, now this is the other housing that I cleaned up. This is the housing that had the axle that was kind of ground up in it. And after I cleaned it up, you can see that there's actually scratches, deep scratches and gouges on the inside of this housing in the same area where the axle's got that damage. So what I believe happened here is, I believe that when the bearing, which is actually outboard here to the wheel, at some point failed completely and broke apart, I think the axle with the hub and the wheel on it actually started to come out. And when it started to come out, the vehicle was still rolling, and maybe they even tried to drive it that way. I'd be willing to bet they didn't stop right there. They probably just said, oh well, maybe we can limp it along back to the house or wherever they were going, and just kept driving it. And the axle, the end of the axle was inside here, and it was just down like that, and just because of the weight of the vehicle on the wheel, just ground that up. So it looks like the only thing that really retains this axle from coming out is the fact that it's behind the bearing, and the bearing is retained by a clip here. So Jim Morrison, everybody. Now I'm going to install the rear axle bearings that came in. These are from hyperparts.com. They were 18 bucks a piece. It's the cheapest price I found for these particular rear axle bearings. And they basically are just a light press fit into here. These are pretty easy to install. I start by just driving them in with the wood block. That gets them in until they're flush. Driving this down with a drift is pretty difficult because there's such a narrow wall of metal there to hit. So in order to avoid slipping off and damaging this sealing material here that keeps this closed bearing, I have a 36mm socket that fits in there really well, and I just put that on there like that, block of wood on top, tap it right down, and was able to fully seat that bearing. And so now all that's left to do to finish installation of that bearing is to install the retaining ring, which is this is an inside style retaining ring, which basically just get my retaining ring pliers in there and compress it down and slide it down into this groove, and it snaps into place. And that's what it looks like when the clip is properly installed. Now I'm going to install the seals on the rear axles. Now that I have the bearings installed, this seal basically goes in this way, and it just pushes in. Alright, got these seals in. Basically, they just push in and then drive them home. I've got this pipe fitting, again, came in really handy. It's good size to push on the seal and tap down lightly and basically seat both of these seals. Okay, I'm going to get ready to start putting together the rear end, install the axle housings and the axles on the rear end. I want to make sure that I put the axle that came out of this housing back with this housing. This is the one that had some ground up area on it here where it looked like it popped out at some point, and they continued to run it and kind of tore it up, and that had markings that matched the inside of this housing. So this axle is going to go with this housing. Even though both of these axles are actually identical, they have the same part number even for replacement purposes. The reason why I want to keep them all together is because there may be some wear issues on one axle versus the other, that maybe these splines are worn a little bit differently than these splines, and I want to make sure everything mates up pretty well. Okay, this is the little paper gasket that belongs right in here, and the original ones were pretty trashed. So now that this is all nice and cleaned up, I'm going to install the paper gasket. I'm going to put just a very small film of RTV type sealant on here. This is such a thin paper gasket. I want to make sure I get a good seal and that stays watertight. I believe that's what the purpose of this gasket is to keep this sealed. As far as where the gasket goes, you can only put it on one way because of the unusual shape. Also, the unusual shape guarantees that you're going to orient this on here correctly, and it also stops you from accidentally putting the housing on the wrong side, because the shape of the mounting port on the other side of this differential for the other shaft over there is completely different shape. It's a completely different shape, so you don't have to worry about that either. So I'm going to put a little bit of a film on this gasket, and then the other thing to remember is you have to install the shaft, the axle, before you put the housing on, because the size of the bearing and the seal, mostly the bearing, is actually, the ID on this bearing is smaller than the OD of this thick part of the shaft. So anyways, I'm going to do that. I'm also going to put some white lithium grease on the splines before I install it, just in case I have to take it apart in the near future. It'll keep it from being all seized up on me. So I'll do that now. Okay, the 4 bolts, this extra long one obviously goes here, but these other three bolts. One of them is shorter than the other two. The short bolt actually goes here, which if this was installed in the unit, this would be facing the ground and the front of the machine. So this is the short bolt goes here, and the two longer ones go in the rear. Okay, I just had the housing bolted down, and what I'm finding is that the axle is not centered in the bore here, and I can't even pull it over to where it should be. It looks like it's going over there now, but what's actually happening is it's lifting up the housing here. So when the housing's bolted down firmly, I can't get the axle into position, so something's wrong here. I've got to figure out what it is. So I'm taking the housing back off. Well, rolling the axle across the flat bench top doesn't indicate that it's bent in any way. At least if it is bent, it's bent very slightly, not enough to explain the fact that it doesn't want to go in. I'm going to just try reinserting it, only orienting it in different positions to see if that makes a difference. Well, it's still off center. I tried rotating it, pulling it out of the splined gear assembly in a couple different positions, and it still seems off center. You know, where it should be ideally about there. No, it's off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the axle housing loose, install the hub, which will allow this part right here to engage the inner race of the bearing, and then try and see if I can tighten the housing down and pull it into line. And if there's too much resistance and all that, I'm going to have to dig deeper into what's going on with this thing. The other thing I'm going to try before I try that is, just for the heck of it, I'm going to try the other axle. I'm going to put the other axle in here, even though that's the axle from the other side, just to see if that makes a difference. Alright, this is the other axle inserted in there, and I got the same exact issue. So that's not it. It's kind of a puzzle, because the and this basically, this gear that this inserts into, this gear assembly inside the differential is held into position by the bearings, and they're all a tight fit. So how could that be offset? It makes no sense, and it doesn't appear to be offset in the hole. So, alright, we're going to try and put the shaft back in, get the hub on there and tighten it down. But before I put the hub on, I want to clean this up better, particularly this area right here. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the area that actually this double-lipped seal rides on. So I want to clean that up, and the easiest way to do that is I've got a small rotary tool, sort of like a Dremel tool, with a very small wire wheel that I could put on there, and I could run that around there and clean that up. Okay, this is my little handheld precision grinding tool. I've got a small, fine sanding drum mounted on there. That's going to allow me to get right in there and clean right around that area. So, okay, that definitely cleaned up pretty well, and from the feel of it, it feels pretty smooth, so hopefully that'll give that seal, that new seal, a fighting chance. Okay, it turns out the mystery here is solved. The problem is that the axle is not supposed to be fully inserted into that differential. When it's fully inserted like it is now, and you install the housing and the hub, and then you can see that hardly any of this end of the shaft is actually even protruding past this point. And you've got to put the nut on there and tighten it. And not only that, but you also have to put this washer on first. So what that indicates to me is that that shaft's not supposed to be fully inserted. And I did notice when I did pull up on the shaft a little bit, it did straighten out that issue of the shaft being off center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install, I'm going to try and see if I can get that nut to catch that enough to pull up on that shaft on the axle. Alright, so it appears that was the problem all along, was that I was fully inserting that axle into the differential. I even called technical assistance line at one of the Octocat dealers that offers free technical assistance, ask the mechanic type help, and he asked me if I had the axles fully inserted, and I said yeah. So he actually thought that they're supposed to be fully inserted also. So he didn't have any ideas on what it might be, and apparently that's the key. But that begs the question as to how tight does this nut get tightened. So I'm going to play around with it and see what it feels like. Also, I'm going to give this a little rotation here and see and make sure that this seems to be turning okay. Placing the assembly on the ground really lets you get some leverage when you're tightening these bolts that hold the axle housing to the differential. Also, it's really going to be the only way to handle putting the other axle housing on. And I rotated the hub there and the differential, and everything seems to be okay. I don't hear any bad sounds. It seems pretty smooth, especially considering I still haven't put differential oil in here yet. To tighten this hub nut, I'll just put a extension bar in here to hold this so I can get leverage on this. Basically, I'm just snugging this up pretty tight and making sure that the hole in the castle nut, the hole in the axle, the end of the axle there actually lines up with one of the grooves in the castle nut so I can insert the cotter pin. Once I get this back outside, I'll clean up this disc brake with a wire wheel, or rotary wire wheel on a grinding angle grinder. That'll make quick work of cleaning this up. Ideally, I would take this off of the hub and do it that way, but my fear is that this has been on there so long that those Allen head screws or hex head screws that are actually cap screws that are holding this on are likely to snap off, and then I'm going to have a whole nother headache on my hands of drilling and tapping and getting the broken screws out and all that. So I'm just going to clean it up as best I can as it is assembled, which shouldn't be too bad because I really don't need to clean all the way down into this area here because the pads only make contact up to here. You can actually see there's a change in the discoloration between here and here. Now's actually a good time to point out that this does have a disc brake on the back. On this particular model, there are disc brakes on the two front hubs and disc brake on only the right rear hub. So when you're putting this all together, it's easy to figure out because this axle housing has the mounting holes for the brake caliper right here, and also the mounting for the emergency, or I should say manual brake. There's a strange setup here where there's a manual brake assembly that's activated by a foot pedal, and then a more conventional hydraulic caliper assembly here that's tied in to the master cylinder located on the front brake lever, and that's also pressurizes the front brakes at the same time. So that's how I know which hub went where. And then as far as which of the three hubs that have discs on them goes on the back, they actually all look almost identical, and I was worried that I had mixed them up, but then I noticed that the front disc brakes have holes drilled in them, which are probably to help cool the front brakes. I'm assuming that's probably factory, but these two have holes, the other one didn't, so that means the other one's the rear. Alright, just a note about this axle housing. This axle housing, because of its shape, doesn't give any clear indication by looking at this end as to how it mounts up. It can actually go on a few different ways, but of course there's only one right way, and that happens to be right like this. This sticker actually faces the rear. Also this right here, where one of the swing arms actually bolts onto, this actually faces up towards the front, and then the other one faces down towards the front. And then of course this bracket right here is where the shock actually attaches, and that is also angled more towards the front, and that corresponds to the housing that is already attached on the other side. It's the same way. Got the shock bracket facing up towards the front, one swing arm bracket facing up towards the front, the other one facing down towards the front. So that's how that goes on. The other dead giveaway is when you looked inside here, even though I did clean this up, you can still see that there's actually a little bit more discoloration in the housing at the very bottom, because when the unit's at rest, any water that was stuck in there would just kind of sit down in the bottom there and corrode that a little worse than everywhere else. But instead of bolting this on here and with the axle behind it like I did the other one, learning from my previous trials and tribulations on that side, what I'm going to do on this side is I'm going to actually insert this axle right up into this housing. And I'm going to install the hub on this side and pull this end of the axle right up into the bearing where it's supposed to be, so that this will actually be assembled, and then I'll attempt to attach it as a complete unit to the differential. And with the whole assembly laying flat like this, as if it was already on the vehicle, I believe that's probably how they intended for this to be worked on, because it seems to me that when I had it up on the bench vertical and was doing this one here, the axle of course wanted to fall back down into the differential further than it was supposed to, and that was causing my issue with alignment. So we'll try that. Of course, before I install the hub, I'm going to clean up this area here. You can see it much better on this one because the disc brake is not in the way. The disc for the disc brake assembly is not in the way, so you can actually see that surface. On this side it's much better. I'm just gonna clean that up lightly with some steel wool, and that should be fine. This worked out much better to just place it vertically on the floor with the axle underneath it, slide the housing down over it, and that brings the end of the axle right up in the air. Put the hub down over it, seat it, and now there's plenty of thread exposed for me to get this washer and nut assembly on here. And then I'll just pick up the whole assembly and insert it into the differential and bolt it up. I also put a liberal coating of lithium grease on the splines before I inserted the hub. Okay, so now that I've got this all tightened up, this axle housing and axle as an assembly is going to be real easy to put on. But before I do, I'm going to put some lithium grease on these splines, and I'm also going to make sure I put in the thin paper gasket that I bought that fits in here, and I'll put just a thin film of RTV sealant on the gasket before I assemble it. Okay, I've got the axle housing and the axle on.